Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah chapter 7, Halacha 7, part 2. And joining us on the phone from the yeshiva is Rabbi David Gilbert. And we were talking about this before this shiur, and we just want to clear up so that it's very clear about what we've been talking about. If you have a case where the entire field are just allelos, or even what we were just talking about where there are some allelos, and the farmer didn't start to harvest yet, the poor doesn't have a right to come take them. And it's the act of actually harvesting that lets the allelos to be allelos. Why? Because it's written that way in the Torah. That's a deraita thing in the way it's derived. So in the case of all allelos, for instance, let's say you have this fungus that's infected your vines, and it's basically messed up the clusters of grapes so that some of them are diseased or all of them are diseased, and all of them are allelos, halachic allelos. It's not a case of them being immature because they didn't all develop right because they just didn't develop right. It's a case because you have something that got in the way, and it would be today you would classify it as this type of fungus that's pretty common, and it basically stopped grapes from developing on each cluster so that you're left with halachic allelos, and it's all infected. So what would happen there is that you would be left in a case where if you didn't harvest at all, if you didn't harvest at all, then what would happen is then you didn't trigger allelos. You didn't do your thing to turn on allelos. So basically the ownership of it will still be with the farmer. It's the act of harvesting. And what is harvesting? It's taking off 3 clusters that can produce 1 rivus of wine. And I checked in the yeshiva yesterday with the mishkiach, and he agreed with my reading of the Gemara and the Meforshim, which is that if you have, let's say, 5 clusters and you need 5 clusters to produce a rivus, we both agree with the reading that wouldn't suffice. You can't take 1,000 clusters to make a rivus. No, it has to be 3. There has to be 3 in there that can produce a rivus, and you have 2 conditions. It has to make a rivus, and you have to have at least 3 of them. If you have 1,000 allelos and 3 clusters that are good, that counts as a harvest, and the poor people would be entitled to the 997 allelos, and the owner would get the 3 clusters of grapes and his rivus of grape juice to drink for Kiddush. So we're gonna so that's triggering when allelos happens, and even if the whole vineyard is not full of allelos, and this is not just a Talmudic point. This is a real world point that is in real agriculture. There are blights, and in modern archaeology, they've found old funguses and molds and mildews and blights from crops when they do excavation. So the funguses and blights that I'm not saying the exact variety, but you had them today. You have them today. You had them then, and so we could be talking about a case of a diseased field, or partially diseased, or you just generally have. You're always going to have some clusters that just don't develop, or they develop in an odd way. Who gets that? So the other thing to point out is that with one of those funguses, the grapes that do remain are perfectly fine. A lot of the grapes don't look so good, but a lot of the grapes are just fine. So who would get that? A poor person could still eat it. It still could be used for grape juice. You just have to take them off and leave off, the blighted ones, but you could still use it. Those still look firm. They still look like they have value to it. It's just not ideal. So today in the Gemara, we're going to come up with an amazing puzzle by Rabbi Yochanan, and I've been working on this puzzle, and I have an answer for it. Yerushalmi and Rabbi Yochanan organizes the Yerushalmi in a way to give you puzzles to sharpen the mind and to try to get an understanding of the deeper points of the halacha. And in this Gemara, we're going to be running into one of those, and I'm going to point it out so that you can pause the video if you want, and you can think about if you can come up with the answer as well. But I'm pretty sure I have the answer, and I'm going to share it with you. And what we're going to get into in this is we're going to talk about the Shmita year, and do we need Shmita for consecrated vines? How's that going to work? So that's going to be really an interesting thing. So let's really get into the Gemara and get started. So yesterday, in part one of this video, we were talking about if somebody plants a vineyard for the temple treasury or they consecrated it. So we know that temple produce is always going to be exempt from Orlah, from Revi'i, from Alelos. It's going to be exempt from Shkikaka, Leket, Peah. It's exempt from Meiser Sheni. It doesn't have to give tithes at all. It doesn't have to separate Truma Gedola. Why? Why doesn't it have to? Because it's the property of the divine, right? It all comes down in the Torah to your property. Your property. If it's your property, you're not the divine. You're always not God. You're always not, having anything with divinity. So it's your, wheat, or it's your grapes, and so you have to separate tithes from that. But the temple, that's property of the divine, and so the temple doesn't need to separate tithes out for Kohanim or for Leviim or to give to the poor people, because the holiness and the sanctity of something that is owned by the divine, that is owned by the temple, and is for the service of the temple, is at a higher spiritual level of kedusha than a farmer who has some unconsecrated wheat that's going to be used for general things. So, that can be subject to tameh and tahor if it were to get wet, but, and it's disconnected from the ground and everything else, but those will still be subject to tithes for the poor. But the temple is not subject to that. Now, here's the wrinkle here, right? It is going to be subject to the laws of Shmita. So you say to yourself, wow, how can that be? I mean, here's the deal about the Shmita produce, right? Shmita produce it can be used, you can go out to the field. These are the aftergrowths. This is, on the 7th year, and you didn't farm for the 7th year. You didn't farm or tend to the ground, certainly a month before Rosh Hashanah, and after, a few months before that, you're sitting there not tilling the ground to make it look like you're preparing for that. You're not planting a month before Rosh Hashanah. You're not getting things ready, and so what happens is that you'll still have aftergrowths that pop up out of the ground. For instance, onions can survive and make offshoots for years, and they split underground and they make new bulbs underground by splitting and keep going. Same with potatoes, and you can have it where the harvest comes for the next year. It's just that you're not allowed to use it. But poor people and rich people and animals are allowed to go into the field and take it and use it, right? But you're not allowed to sit there as the owner of the field and say, okay, I'm going to make commerce off of this, right? It's just, you have to let the land rest. It can be used like these potatoes on the 7th year that have been sitting there incubating, because there's bulbs and spuds in the ground there because it's been a potato field for 5 years. And those will split and make more on the Shmita year, and greens will pop up, and you'll be able to identify where these new potatoes are during the 7th year. Those can be used for eating. You can make it into vodka if you want. You can make it into fuel for a lamp. You can make it into anointing oil. but you can't use it for any other purpose. You can't use it for transactions. You can't use it to make money off of it. It's a very big sin if you make money off of Shmita produce. There are a lot of curses that will come onto you, and it's really, one of the midrashim in Midrash Rabbah say that the Jews mida keneged mida, measure for measure. They didn't want to accept and follow the laws of the land, and because they were following the other laws, like they were keeping Shabbat, but they weren't following the laws of the land, Hashem basically wrote this decree in heaven that, hey, those people that aren't following, no problem. You can go to Bavel, where you don't need to follow the laws of Shmita there either, because there is no Shmita there. Over in New York and in America, you don't need to worry about, doing Shmita, because you don't have Shmita in New York. In the Catskills or White Plains or whatever, wherever you are, in Muncie, you don't have to worry about Shmita produce, but you do in the land. And so, if you're not going to keep the laws related and connected to the land, mida keneged mida, Hashem will just send you to a place where you don't need to worry about doing the laws of the land. That's what the Midrash says. So you're not allowed to make commerce out of it. And by the way, the other thing about the Shemitah produce is you have to use it during the Shemitah year. That, by the way, you have this concept in Israel called Heter Mehira. And every time I go through Shvius, I look at Heter Mehira and I scratch my head. I really have a hard time looking at how Shvius is written and the intent of it, and how we have people ruling that you can use this produce for an economic way with these sorts of contracts to allow it. I just scratch my head every time. The point about the Shemitah year produce, it can't be wasted, and it has to be used during that year. So you're not allowed to leave it on to the next year. Now, here's what's surprising, right? This Baraisa from yesterday is telling us that the Shvius year is going to actually even apply for the fields that might even be owned by the temple itself. So how can that be? It's a very surprising Hekdesh to learn about, that you can have something that's sanctified and has this kedusha and it belongs to the divine, and now this has to have a Shemitah year. It can't be used for the temple. It's very surprising. So let's go into the explanation. We're going to now try to get into a scriptural source for how it could be where for the temple treasury, this sort of vineyard or field will be subject to Shvius. So Rabbi Zera in the Gemara says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the verse states, and the land shall rest a Sabbath for Hashem. And the Gemara continues and says, the words for Hashem teach that the sanctity of Shmita takes effect even on something that is for Hashem. In other words, what this is trying to say is that even if you have a consecrated vineyard, it's going to be subject to the law of Shmita. That's how they're deriving this Doraita. Now you can see this in Leviticus 25:2. And let me read this statement again so that you're really on board with this. In the Torah it says, and the land shall rest a Sabbath for Hashem. And they're looking at for Hashem, and what they're saying is that the sanctity of the Shemitah even goes on something that's for Hashem, and that this is a Doraita proof for it. Now, this Baraisa stated that you have this consecrated vineyard and it's going to be subject to the law of Shemitah, but there's going to be a question about how this fruit can even be consumed. Okay, so we accept as a Doraita thing that this Doraita, by Doraita, has the Shvius in the seventh year to it. But how do you eat it? What do you do with it, right? So the Gemara is going to explain it. Rabbi Chia bar Abba inquired before Rabbi Manna, to eat the consecrated Shemitah fruit and produce without redeeming it is not possible. For it is not possible for a consecrated object to leave its consecrated state without redemption. And as long as it remains consecrated, it is prohibited for benefit. For the former owner to redeem the fruit with money and eat it is also impossible. In other words, he can't come and buy it back. Okay? For he is then found to be as one who purchases an axe with the money of Shmita, which is also forbidden. So, how can this consecrated Shmita fruit be made permissible for consumption? So, this is a little bit of a halachic puzzle to work out, right? So, normally, somebody who wants to benefit from an object that's been consecrated to the temple, he has to purchase it, that's redeeming it, and he redeems the object from the temple so that the temple doesn't get any loss from it, okay? And the person who's redeeming it is not allowed to get a profit off of it, okay? Because if you do, or you underpay it, what happens is you're now getting mila, and you're taking benefit from something belonging to the divine, and you will get a special death from heaven punishment, and it's not pretty. So you want to be very careful about that. So when they redeem the money, okay, it's going to assume the sanctity that was, used to be on this object. Okay, so let's say you're redeeming these grapes not in the Shvius year. Okay, you're in the ninth year. Okay, you're in the ninth year of this vine's life, and it's 2 years after the Shmita year, and you want to buy back some grapes. Okay, no problem. You make sure you figure out the exact value of these grapes, and you pay the temple for it, and then the temple has no net loss for this grape, and the sanctity gets switched from the grapes onto the coins, and the temple retains the coins. And then you're left with deconsecrated grapes in this ninth year. That's 2 years after the Shemitah year, and there's no worry about Meiser and Revi'i, and there's no worry about that. And so then you can eat and use those grapes, because again, the temple didn't have any offset. There's no loss. It's an exact switch in value. So after you redeem the money, that money is going to get the sanctity that was on those grapes. It gets switched, and then the object loses all its kedusha, and it's just a regular thing of grapes, but this money has sanctity. So in this case, where you have the produce getting consecrated with the Shemitah sanctity, okay, as well as temple sanctity, we can't just do this. And the Gemara tells us we can't just do this because, okay, even if you got out of the temple sanctity, you didn't get out of the Shemitah sanctity, and you have to consume it on the same time. So basically what this Gemara is telling us is that the person who he sold the grapes and then he's trying to buy them back, he's forbidden to redeem them and deconsecrate the fruit on the vineyard that he consecrated, because if he does it, he's using money that's consecrated with Shemitah sanctity for a commercial transaction. Okay, basically the terminology here is he's purchasing an axe, right? Why is it an axe? They're using a metaphor to be like it's an axe to cut down the Torah, right? God forbid, which you're not allowed to do. Okay, so the key wrinkle here is that you're not allowed to do commercial transactions with Shemitah produce. So if he comes to buy and deconsecrate these grapes and consecrate the money and switch it off, so it's an exact exchange, the money gets kedusha, the grapes get desanctified. The problem is, they say, you just made a commercial transaction on the Shvius year, and this is Shvius produce. You're not allowed to do that. It's like you're cutting down the Torah. So how do you do this? What do you do? So during the Shemitah year, the produce of the temple is going to be consecrated and has two types of sanctity. Okay, first of all, it's consecrated with the temple sanctity, and it's consecrated with the Shemitah sanctity. And the issue is, if you switch it, okay, then the money is also going to be getting Shemitah sanctity in this exchange. It doesn't just get the sanctity from the temple treasury part. This now is also getting halachic kedusha from shvius. Shvius produce has some sanctity, which is why you're not allowed to waste it. So by acquiring it, you're effectively putting this this money into a case where it has two kinds of sanctity. And by exchanging the money and putting it onto it, the shvius sanctity, that now becomes a commercial transaction, and you're not allowed to do it. So, by the way, this ban on engaging in commerce with Shmita produce, okay, that's Doraita. Okay, that's actually in there. And if you'll check out Leviticus 25:6, it's going to talk about that the Shmita produce is yours to eat. Okay, that means that you have to eat it. It means that you can't use it for commercial transactions. So that's going to be a big point. Now, keep in mind that we're gonna get into. Let's just get into the explanation. So the Gemara says the temple treasurer exchanges the consecrated Shmita fruit for money in the hand of another. So in other words, what it's saying is it doesn't use the person who originally consecrated the vineyard. And when this does, if this happens, the fruit leaves its consecrated status and it becomes permitted for consumption. So let's take a look at the Mara Fulda to help us here. And here's how he says it. He's saying that this Gemara explains that the consecrated Shmita fruit becomes permitted through the temple treasurer exchanging it for the money of someone other than the person who originally consecrated it. So you have to go to a third person and use a third person for help. And in that case, the person performs no mitzvah by purchasing the fruit, for the mitzvah of redemption is exclusive to the one who consecrated it. So he is not considered to be using Shmita sanctified money for commercial transaction. So let's look at the Mara Fulda because he explains all of this. All right, so let's work on it. When the fruit leaves, this is Mara Fulda. When the fruit leaves the possession of the temple, its temple sanctity is transferred to the money, because there is no longer consecrated to the holy. It is permitted for benefit. Okay, that fruit now is not consecrated, so you're allowed to use it when it's not consecrated. The fruit, though, it still has the Shmita sanctity, and so that's going to be the issue. So even after it's redeemed, you have to use it like in a way for Shmita. So Mara Fulda explains how the temple treasury deals with this. Okay, and here's what he says. He says that the money that it receives in exchange for the consecrated Shmita produce, all right, this money is now consecrated with these two forms of sanctity. One is the temple sanctity, and that was when it was transferred from the produce and transferred onto the money. And it also has the consecrated Shmita sanctity on account of being used to purchase Shmita produce. But because Shmita sanctified money may not be used for commercial transactions, the temple must remove the Shmita sanctity before it can make use of the money. In other words, the temple itself is also not allowed, says Mara Fulda, to take money and use it for commercial transactions. So this is a big issue for everybody, even for the property of the divine. The property of the divine is not allowed to use commercial transactions with its own money on Shmita produce. If this money now has sanctity for Shvius, it can't take these coins and go purchase things with it. Okay, it has to get rid of this sanctity. So how do they do it? Mara Fulda explains that this is accomplished by the temple treasurer deconsecrating the money onto Hulin money that someone else held, with the intent of removing only its Shmita sanctity. And when this is done, the money belonging to the outsider assumes Shmita sanctity. and it is used by the owner in accordance with the rules of Shmita produce. So the temple money, however, is still consecrated to the holy and is free from Shmita sanctity and can be used in a commercial transaction. Um, so I just want to point out one more point by the Marafulda about this. This could not have been accomplished by deconsecrating the original Shmita produce on money belonging to an outsider, for actual Shmita produce can never be deconsecrated. Deconsecration is possible only when the items possessing secondary Shmita sanctity, such as money, is exchanged for Shmita produce. So I want to point out what the Vilna Goan says about this. And he's saying that the Gemara is saying that the redeeming of the consecrated Shmita produce is like purchasing an axe with Shmita money. It is not referring to the original consecrator, as what the Marafulda explained, but it was focused on how the temple treasury could possibly make use of this money when it received in exchange for the produce, had this kedusha. And the Gemara points out that when the consecrated Shmita produce is redeemed, the money assumes Shmita sanctity. There's two sanctities here. So the Vilna Gaon continues and says, thus, when the temple treasurer uses the money, it's as if he purchased an axe with the Shmita money. In other words, he's performed a commercial transaction with Shmita sanctified money, which you're not allowed to do. So how then is the temple to derive the use of the money it received in exchange for the produce? What do? The Vilna Gaon says the temple treasurer has to deconsecrate the money onto hulin money, as we just read in the Marafulda. He has to deconsecrate the money onto hulin money provided by a third party, another one, with the intention of removing the Shemitah sanctity from the consecrated coins onto the hulin coins held by the third party. And in this way, the Shemitah sanctity is transferred to the hulin coins, which are then used for approved Shemitah purposes. There are certain things that you can do with Shemitah coins. So since now the temple money remains with only, the temple consecration only, it may be used for all the temple needs. So this is a way that in any which way of these cases, you need a third party. In the case of I want to take the time to try to explain how this works with consecration, deconsecration, and what's going to happen with the Shemitah produce with the temple. So very, very simple. Let's say the rabbi on the phone, Rabbi David Gilbert, he has a vineyard, and it's the 9th year, so is no subject to Orlah. There's no obligation for Revi'i. There's no obligation for any of this stuff, and it's just a normal year. It's not the Shvius year, and he wants to go and he wants to designate this as property for the temple. So he's allowed to do that. Now it has kedusha. Now it belongs to the temple, and if he takes the grapes from it, then he's doing Mila, and it would be very bad. So he doesn't want to do that. But let's say he wants to get the grapevine back. So let's go, and he has to assess the value, the true value. He's not allowed to profit off of it. And let's say the true value is $500. So he writes a check deconsecrates he takes $500 out of his pocket, and he deconsecrates the sanctity from that vine, which is exactly worth 500, onto what is exactly worth $500. And now there's no loss. He gives the temple treasurer the $500, and there's no loss. He gets his vine back, and the temple has no loss either, and they have $500. They can use it for whatever. Now, the trouble comes when you have a case where this lands on the 7th year, because let's say he sanctifies the vineyard or the vine, and he wants to get the fruit back. Okay. The problem is that the fruit has sanctity not only because it has kedusha, because it belongs to the temple property, but also because now it also has this shvius sanctity. So if he went and made a transaction directly with the temple to deconsecrate it, the problem is that the temple is effectively going and transacting for shvius produce, and so is Rabbi Gilbert. So he can't do that. Now, there's a rule on this. Okay, you're allowed to do it if it's a one-off case and it's not for wholesale. So you can make a sale of produce just to dispose of it. It has to be eaten on that year. You can't waste it, but you can't do it as a business. Okay, and the temple is definitely not allowed to be in the business of being in a business. Okay, it's just doing a transaction and it's doing offerings. That's its job. It's not a profit driven thing. Okay, so the temple has a problem. It can't sell the produce back to Rabbi Gilbert because it's a shvius. It's effectively like a shvius transaction. Okay, between the two of them, and not only that, it's also doesn't really look good. It really doesn't look good to be selling it back to him because it really does look like a transaction. You probably could find some heterim, but really, probably there's going to be some strict rulings that are going to say that you really can't do it. It really is not the right kind of transaction. So in that case, you have to go find a third party. So what happens? Okay, let's say he just has these grapes. He sanctifies it over on the vine, and he wants to get it back. Well, he really can't. He can't. What does a temple do with it? What does the temple treasury do with it? So he can't sell it back either on this shvius year. So he has to go and sell it to these grapes. If the temple decides they want to do it, he has to go sell these grapes to a third party, somebody who is not Rabbi Gilbert. And that person takes his chulin money and he purchases these grapes. Now this person has shvius produce and he has to eat it on that year, and he has to use it and he can't waste it. And it's not going to be considered to be a business transaction because the temple is not a business. It's not a wholesale transaction where it's like a guy in a shuk just selling lots and lots of grapes. But then you say, well, wait a second. Why isn't it like that? What if there's lots and lots and lots of grapes that the temple has and it wants to get rid of it? It has lots of these vines and it doesn't want to keep the produce and it wants to just get rid of it. Okay. So what happens is you would say, well, let's say it now becomes a very large volume of it where it looks like you're a wholesaler. And the truth is that the temple is not making a profit on that. Okay. And then the guy in the shuk, he is going to be making a profit on it. You're not allowed to profit off of shvius produce. And the guy who's buying it, okay, he's buying it to use it and eat it. He's not buying it because he's trying to do wholesale and business and transact in it. He's just getting it and using it, okay? And if you're doing it as a one-off thing, you're allowed to do it for your own use, but you're not allowed to make a business from it. So the temple is not making a business from it. Now you say to yourself, okay, well, what about this second case? Second case is that there's these vines, and now the temple just decides, they don't want Rabbi David Gilbert's vines anymore. Well, he really can't buy them back on the shvius year because perhaps it has this shvius produce on there that he could cut off and harvest, right? And so then it looks like that transaction again. So you can't do that. So the temple still has to go sell it to a third party. Well, let's say that the temple wants to get rid of it. Well, what they would do is they would transact it with this third party for chulin coins, and they get chulin coins. So this other guy gets the vineyard, the vine, and the grapes on it. And, in the first case I just talked about, he just gets the grapes. In this case, he gets the vine and the grapes. Okay. And Rabbi Gilbert can't get back that vine on that year because it's really like he's doing transaction to, get the produce that's already still on the vine. Okay. Now what happens if the temple has coins that has the temple sanctity on it, the temple kedusha on it, and they also have, for whatever reason, these coins that were donated or whatever, and it has shvius sanctity on it. So here's how this works, okay? They go back to this third person that's not connected to Rabbi Gilbert, and the temple goes and exchanges it for shvius coins. And now the temple has chulin coins, which now has sanctity. The person who's the third party had chulin coins, exchanged them, and now he has shvius coins. And then you say to yourself, what on earth can you do with shvius coins? Well, one of the things you can do with it is you can leave it out as, for poor people to collect. Just like you could leave out the produce for poor people to collect, so too you can leave out the coins if you wanted to leave it to charity. Alternatively, what you could do is that you could go back to this case where you say, oh, this is shvius, and I'm not doing it as a business, and I'm not doing it as wholesale, and I'm not doing it as something that looks bad. And so what I can do is I can buy, something to eat. I can buy some meat, or I can buy some, wine, or I can buy some grain, turn it into bread. But I have to use all of it, and I can't waste it, and I have to do it on that year. Okay, and so that's how the person who ends up with this Shmita coin is able to use it. The temple really can't use the Shmita coins because it can't eat anything. And let's say, the temple, you would say, well, it's a temple, let it just buy cows and then burn it. But then you'd say, well, you're not allowed to burn something that has Shmita Kedusha. You're not allowed to make offerings that have that Shmita sanctity on it. You're not allowed to burn and waste and destroy anything that has that Shmita sanctity. So that's why the temple has to get rid of those coins. It has this problem. The third party does not. So let's continue. The Gemara was now talking about the Shmita year and the fruit and the sanctity. And it's assumed that understanding how this produce can be eaten at all. And now the Gemara is going to question this. Rabbi Matanya said, and why do we not say here, like the statement that Rabbi Yochanan said concerning one who declares a vow to prohibit the benefit of his possessions to another person? In that case, Rabbi Yochanan commented on the ruling of Rabbi Yossi, which asserted that even if the vower, the person making the vow, would declare one of his possessions ownerless, it would still be prohibited. And Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan qualified this ruling with the following statement. The words of Rabbi Yossi are due to the vow having preceded the declaration of ownerlessness. In other words, once you have this vow take effect on a particular object, its prohibition is not removed by subsequently declaring the object ownerless. So an object can be declared ownerless before the vow is uttered, and that's permitted, but the vower, the person making the vow, certainly does not intend for it to be included in the vow. In other words, Mara Fulda explains this like this. He says, Rabbi Yochanan explains that Rabbi Yossi's ruling applies only where the vower declared the property ownerless after making the vow. Rabbi Yossi rules that once a vow takes effect on an item, the prohibition cannot be removed later by simply declaring the item ownerless. And this assumes that a declaration of ownerlessness does not take effect until someone actually acquires the object from Hefker. Since it remains the property of the person who vowed it until it is acquired, it remains prohibited despite his declaration. That doesn't necessarily fix it because it could still be until it's acquired, you didn't really get rid of anything. So now the Gemara is gonna sharpen this question, and here's how the Gemara concludes it. It says, and here too, in the case of a person who consecrates his vineyard, since the ownerlessness of the Shmita fruit preceded its consecration, the Shmita fruit is not consecrated and may be consumed without being redeemed. So then why doesn't Rabbi Mana give this response to Rabbi Chia bar Abba's question? In other words, Mara Fulda says, by biblical decree, all produce of Shmita is ownerless. It's like it's Hefker, and it's going to be free to be gathered by everybody. So even though you have a person that may have consecrated his vineyard before the onset of the particular Shemitah year, the law of Shemitah was set down in Mount Sinai long before this vineyard was ever consecrated. So it could be said regarding any consecrated field or vineyard that the ownerlessness of the Shemitah year already precedes its consecration. So that's a big question, and that's a big answer, and then it's just basically leaving it. So let's take a look at the Pnei Moshe to help us to understand what's going on here. Basically, Rabbi Matanya is wondering why, when Rabbi Chia bar Abba asked how the fruit of the vineyard is to be used during the Shemitah year, Rabbi Mana simply doesn't answer that the fruits that grow during the Shemitah year are not consecrated. Because again, what their point is, they're saying that it's not really a valid declaration, because the Shemitah produce is effectively Hefker, and this came from Mount Sinai, and this precedes it, and you know what year the seventh year is. So it's basically like a neder that doesn't really apply. I want to take a look at another way to read Rabbi Matanya's question by the Vilna Goan. They're saying that Rabbi Matanya is focused on Rabbi Yossi's ruling in this Mishnah, where he stated that if a person consecrates his vineyard after the alelos can be discerned, the poor must pay back the temple treasury for the nourishment the alelos received from the ground and the vine. And Rabbi Matanya points out that in Masechet Nedarim, Rabbi Yossi rules that a person does not intend his vow to take effect on an object that he previously declared as ownerless. And Rabbi Matanya argues that the same should apply when a person consecrates a vineyard. And since the poor came into possession of the alelos before the person consecrated the vineyard, we should be able to assume that he did not intend to consecrate the nourishment needed for the alelos. And accordingly, says the Vilna Gaon, the poor should not be obligated to repay the holy for the value they received. So, one way to look at this, according to what Rabbi Yossi is saying, Rabbi Yossi is saying that, you know that before you consecrate these alelos, you know that you're going to need a certain amount of nutrition to get them from point A to point B, from where from where they are now, let's say a third ripened, until they finish the next 2/3 of ripening. And so when you're consecrating it, it's kind of like the story about the people from Jericho, right? You're consecrating it in a way where you know that you're consecrating the trunk, but you're basically you're taking out everything else, including the nourishment, the earth, and the nutrition that comes from the roots for that part of the grape. So just like the people of Jericho were consecrating these carob trees and leaving the branches unconsecrated so that the fruit would draw nourishment through the earth and through the trunk, that basically that nourishment part is going to be carved out. So they're saying that that implies that basically that's what the sages are saying, right? They're saying that this implies that that you're going to need this nourishment to get it to finish harvest, to harvest, and that nobody is going to sit there and cut that out, because if you did, you wouldn't be able to use the fruit. So if you consecrated it exactly on that day of the 1/3 growth, you would not be entitled to anything that grew after the 1/3, and nobody would consecrate that. Okay, so Rabbi Yossi is saying, but if they did, then it's also going to be the property of the owner. And who's the owner? That's going to be the temple. So you would have to repay the owner, being the temple treasurer, for the increased growth if you're using the nutrition. Okay, so the disagreement here between Rabbi Yossi and the sages is that the sages are saying when you consecrate this over to the temple, you're going to be leaving out the amount of nutrition you need to finish this up. Rabbi Yossi's coming along and saying, wait a second, but if you didn't do that, then you have to pay this increased amount. So the Mishnah said, Rabbi Yossi said, if he consecrates the vineyard after the alelos can be discerned, the poor must donate the value of the new growth to the holy. Why? Because we're talking about the consecrated amount and the nutrition for that consecrated amount being owned by the temple. And but the sages are saying, wait, but nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to consecrate part of it so it can't get any value later on and have it survive because it needs nutrition. So that part is going to be implicitly cut out. But Rabbi Yochanan is going to say something surprising, and here's how we get into our puzzle. This is a Yerushalmi puzzle. This is a classic Yerushalmi puzzle. The Gemara rules regarding this dispute between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yossi. And here's what it says. Rabbi Yochanan said, there was an incident in which a person consecrated his vineyard after the alelos could be discerned, and the rabbis, the Tanna Kama, ruled in accordance with Rabbi Yossi. So here you are with a puzzle, a Yerushalmi puzzle, and you say to yourself, what case could there possibly be where the Tanna Kama themselves, in this case about consecration, rule like Rabbi Yossi, where they say, no, the nourishment, it has to be, this increase in the size was not included in the nourishment, and you have to pay the temple treasury for this increase in size because the nourishment wasn't included. What on earth case could that be? Can you think of it? Maybe you want to pause the video and come back and check the answer. So here's the answer. Here's the only case I can think about where this would be the halacha, and this would be the correct case, and a case where the sages themselves would rule like Rabbi Yossi. This would be a case where if you had a vineyard and you had the alelos, and you consecrated the person, let's say the poor person consecrated the alelos to the temple treasury, okay? So now the ownership of the alelos is with the temple. Okay, all of it is, including, by the way, the nourishment. Now, if the person comes and wants to redeem it and buy back this cluster of grapes, he can do so. But just like if you're over in Jericho and you're saying, okay, I'm going to consecrate this trunk and I'm going to leave out these branches to take the nourishment, and the sages, by the way, are saying, hey, this is a normal way to consecrate because this increase of growth, you're going to anticipate this increase of growth is going to need a certain amount of nutrition to get from point A to point B, and you're going to retain ownership of that. It's the same too here. The temple treasury on the reverse side is going to keep the nourishment in the trunk and the nourishment in the earth, and it's going to own it, and it's going to sell you just back the cluster. Now, if you want to harvest it right now, you can. But if you're going to wait, and it's going to increase in size and value because you waited and you used the nourishment from that now belong to the temple treasury, now even the Tanna Kama would rule like Rabbi Yossi, and they would say you have to repay the amount extra that grew from this nourishment back to the temple treasury, or else it's Mila, and you get that from heaven. So if you have a case where you consecrate the whole vine to the temple, not on the Shmita year, of course, and now you want to buy it back, you're not getting the temple, you're not getting back the nourishment, and you're not necessarily getting back the use of the trunk. Okay, this is a case where you're buying back not the entire vine, you're not buying back the entire earth, You're not making this entire transaction. You're just buying the cluster. And if you're just buying the clusters only, then that is going to be what the halacha is. And even the Tanakama are going to rule like Rabbi Yosei, and that's the solution to this Yerushalmi puzzle. The Mishnah now is going to talk about what about grapes? What do you need to do where they become shchicha? And this is very straightforward, and then we'll finish up. So the Mishnah ruled that the fruit of trellis vines does not become shchicha until the harvester moves out of arm's reach. And and then here's how the Gemara is going to read. It says, does this Mishnah not pose a difficulty for Rabbi Yochanan? For Rabbi Yochanan said, once the harvester had passed by the tree and forgotten its remaining produce, it is shchicha, and even if it is still within arm's reach. So our Mishnah, however, rules that the fruit on the trellis vine is not shchicha until the harvester moves out of arm's reach. So they're asking, hey, doesn't that contradict the ruling of Rabbi Yochanan? And the Gemara is going to give a resolution just like that. And it says, it is different in the case of a trellis vine, for it is the owner's practice to check these vines frequently, and therefore their shchicha is delayed until the harvester moves out of arm's reach. But in ordinary trees, like what Rabbi Yochanan was talking about, it becomes shchicha as soon as the harvester passes by. Now the Gemara is going to pose a question based on the Mishnah's ruling concerning vines lying on the ground. What about those, right? We're talking about trellis vines, but what about the shchicha of vines on the ground? Here's what it says. It says, but does this Mishnah not pose a difficulty even for Rabbi Hoshaya? For Rabbi Hoshaya said, I was treading olives with Rabbi Chia the Great, and he said to me the following. He says, even after you finish plucking an olive tree, any olive remaining on the harvested tree that you can stretch out your hand and take is not shchicha. Basically, what they're saying is, hey, Rabbi Hoshaya's ruling is that as long as a fruit is within arm's reach, it is not shchicha. But the Mishnah seems to be ruling that the fruit of the ground vines becomes shchicha as soon as the harvester passes it by. So doesn't that contradict what Rabbi Hoshaya says? What does Rabbi Hoshaya say? He's saying that even after you finish plucking an olive tree, any olive remaining on the harvested tree that you could reach out your hand and take is not shchicha. So isn't that a contradiction? And the Gemara solves it just like that. It says, it is different in the Mishnah's case. For each and every vine on the ground is considered to be a separate row. And basically what it's saying is they're saying that it is a rule that even a harvester, once a harvester leaves a row, he may not return, even if he is within arm's length. And since these vines are halachically going to be treated as rows, the same rule is going to apply. And an ordinary tree, like an olive tree, does not become shchicha until the harvester moves beyond arm's reach. So there is a distinction here between a normal tree and a grapevine that's growing on the ground. Basically, what they're saying is that the nature of this grapevine growing on the ground is such that it itself is treated like a row. And an individual tree doesn't have this characteristic, and that is why it is different.